Hi, Louisa. I'm so excited to have you on Wyatt's podcast, and I'm so honored to have you. And I have been like inspired by you for so long, and I'm sure whoever listens to it is gonna be. So let's start with introductions.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm Dr. Louisa Penfold, and I work here at the Harvard Graduate School Education as a lecturer. And I also work at Project Zero doing research around contemporary art and children's play. And Nanvi and I met 18 months ago
Yeah.
for the first time when she started as a graduate student here at HGSE. And we had the joy of working together while Nanvi was a graduate student.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, we worked on art play, we worked on, different classes together. And I'm just so thrilled to see where you've gone after you graduated. It's amazing.
Thank you. I have been obsessed with you from the starting itself, and I've not left you and been like disturbing me for every small thing. So I'm so happy that you have been so like helpful to me throughout and like always. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, of course. Yeah.
So before we start and jump into all the amazing things I've been working on, I would love to know what was the first thing or first memory you remember of being like creative or being in the space of arts. It can be something from your childhood or just something you remember was like, oh yeah, like I love doing this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I grew up in regional Australia, and my father was a forester, and my mum was a school teacher. She taught home economics and textiles, and the school that I went to was in a pretty remote area, and kind of like everyone from would go to these one or two schools from the whole region. And there was not very much arts at all. Like it was kind of like quintessential Australia, and that like football was like the main currency. And I was a little bit sporty, but I think for me, my first encounter was like through my mom and at home. And it wasn't like my family had a lot of money or anything, but mum would always be like setting up, like she would be like sewing and stitching and doing different things. And she'd just get all these scraps together and pull it together and be like, hey, do this. And then I would just like have the best time. And then I think another kind of key piece around like, because I think a really transformative part of the arts is like engaging into this like headspace of like freedom. And to this like embodied space of like freedom and possibility and making connections. And I grew up on a property that had like a lot of land and a lot of bushland, and my brothers and I would go like playing out the bush and like build different cubbies and just engage in this really deep storytelling. And I think like a lot of children, storytelling was like a really powerful connection for me to be able to kind of think about the world from different people's perspectives. Yeah. But yeah, I would certainly say that my own childhood, like I did not have a lot of arts in like elementary, primary school. And I think that was an important experience for me because like when I did encounter those things, when my family moved to the city and I went to a high school that had a lot of arts, it was just like my world opened up. And I played clarinet and I was in all the bands and like in the choir, and like they had an amazing visual arts program, and that changed my life. And I think that I look back and I'm like, I feel a little bit sad sometimes that the kind of art experiences that were offered for me when I was a kid are absolutely nothing like the stuff that I set up for kids now. But I think it's also really important as well for us as educators to know what it's like to not have access, because I think that's a really fundamental push for a lot of people to make sure that others do have access.
And that's lovely, and I'm curious like to kind of talk more about this part of access and like how, because you saw the whole like more tangents of having arts and not having arts, and how has that journey kind of inspired you throughout, like because you worked in different countries, you worked in different like formal education, informal education. If you could talk more about like how you are here today.
Yeah. So after I finished high school, I did like media arts for undergrad, and then I did a master's in museum education, but specializing in working with children and families. And I did my master. I got a scholarship from my university to go over to the Smithsonian, and they have a really wonderful early childhood center there that I went and spent some time at. And like I wrote my thesis around intergenerational learning in the museums. And then after that, I got a job working at the Ipswich Art Gallery in Australia. And my job there was like as a children's curator, designing play spaces for kids and running different workshops and festivals and stuff like that. And I loved it. And Ipswich is like a really important place in that it's an incredibly diverse population, like in terms of like economic opportunities and stuff like that. And the kids and families that I work with there were just like really pushed me to think about the possibilities of the arts and, you know, the possibilities of the arts, you know, in a community that has been politically divided as well. And yeah, and so I guess my journey and in terms of access, I've always been interested in like bringing the arts and working side by side with children and families who may think, oh, the arts are not for me, or this is something that I haven't had the opportunity to engage with before and a little bit hesitant. And you know, so I spent many years working in museums, and when I came to Boston 6 years ago, I really started working with the public school systems, and I think that's where a lot of my attention and focus is today and will continue to be in the future, because I think that the children and families in those communities are the ones who are that's where a lot of the diversity is. And I also think that at this moment in the world, like it is really where we need to be focusing our attention in terms of like children's rights and children's rights to education, children's rights to have their voices listened to and respected, and children's rights to the arts. Yeah. And so I think that's where I find like a lot of inspiration from, is working with those kids.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I would love, before we jump onto like your Boston journey, I would love to ask you a little bit more about like before that, when you were
Yeah.
working with museum education, what were the things, or like highlights, if I may ask, about things which stayed with you and which like, yeah, like your belief kept on going, like this is important, like I need to keep on working on this. And
Yeah.
you have been like championing arts for so long. So I'm excited to know about the conversation which stayed with you about this.
The things that stuck. Yeah, for sure. I mean, so when I was working in Ipswich in particular, I was working with many children who were, you know, born with like fetal alcohol syndrome, or were in like complex family custodial situations. And so a lot of like the families that were coming in having like supervised visits with the parents, with like social workers. And so that really encouraged me to think about, well, how do we set up these conditions for learning where it's really about children and parents playing and making together. And that, I think, was a really big thing for me, is like this. And I think what I always really liked about museum education was that it was thinking about the family unit and the creative learning that can possibly happen within a family unit. And so that really stuck with me, the importance of like positioning parents and carers as children's first educators, and looking at their kind of knowledge and assets that they bring to children's learning. And I think the other thing that really, really stuck with me was around the importance of like multisensory learning and learning through the body, because we have a schooling system that is so heavily focused on reading and writing, which are very, very important forms of knowledge. But it also, my concern is that sometimes those forms of intelligence are valued over other forms, such as like, you know, movement and drawing and working with clay. And so children's brains kind of like develop in this narrow way instead of expanding out. And so I think like for me, like where we can be looking at like museums and whatnot to continue to expand children's creative learning is thinking about the different ways that artists and designers experiment with materials, and looking at how they explore different concepts, fabricate new materials, use different tools, how we can take that and then put it into a form that children can then take up and explore through their play. So materiality has been a huge focus of my work as well. And I think materiality is also where there's a lot of possibility in terms of incorporating children's voices, like giving them the opportunity to play and make with materials in a way that is in alignment with their interests and curiosities, and supporting like adults in kind of positioning themselves as like more like kind of guided play facilitators alongside kids, as opposed to like instructors or like, I'm going to tell you what to make. So yeah, I think that is also, that there's some things that really stuck with me. But my PhD research was really, really thinking about how we incorporate young children's voices into curatorial decision making in institutions. And, you know, because children are often seen as like someone that just needs to be filled up with knowledge. as opposed to like thinking about them as active cultural producers, which is what the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child highlights. And so I think like institutions, whether that be a school, whether that be a museum, whether that be a theatre organisation, there's a lot of work that we can do collectively to be really thinking about different strategies for reflecting on, you know, observing, documenting children's multisensory learning processes, and then reflecting on those as collectively amongst, you know, artists, educators, parents. And this is work that takes like a lot of time and a lot of like intentionality and a lot of willingness to really do that and really value it. And so, but I think it is like the path to really expanding children's rights as cultural producers in the future.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because this whole idea which she talks about, like the hierarchy which always exists in like schooling institutions, and like being able to like fill the vessel of the child, and this whole like anecdote about this is like so like problematic to begin with. And I love like how you're talking also about this idea of like how modeling, like when you open up these spaces in like museum education, and like how like the parents are part of the activity and not they are kind of like an observer and quote unquote, and just like looking at what the child is doing, but they're also like creating with them, and also kind of embodying that like creation for themselves also as adults, which they need more play. Like everybody needs to be like playing, embodying, and I think that's such a beauty of it. And I'm curious because you've worked with like you have worked with across ages. You started with like young children and museums, and now you also work with like in academia and like more with adults and with all across like different diverse people. And I'm curious like how that journey has been here for you, and like kind of reframing the word arts all along this year. So I'm curious to know like how the whole definition of why arts have changed for you across
this span. Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I guess 6 years ago, once I finished my PhD, I started working more intensively with adults and doing like creative workshops with teachers, and then working in higher education and teaching different classes. Like I teach a class here in HGSE called Contemporary and Early Childhood, another one around practice-based research and arts and learning practicum. And at that moment was when I really started thinking intensively around, you know, how do we cultivate the next generation of arts educators who are going to be advocating for like children's rights and playful learning and connections with contemporary art. And I came to realize through doing these workshops, like how important it is to give adults the opportunity to make and play. And I think that, you know, I think artists are incredible players throughout the lifespan. I think that that's one of their most significant contributions that they bring to communities. But I think that, you know, teachers, they're working their butts off. They are so busy. They've got so much administration and like so many things to grapple that they're grappling with, that like sometimes it's just like, it is so easy to like just be like, oh, I don't have time to sit down and make and play with materials. And, you know, I think that is where it's really important in terms of thinking about, well, how do we connect in with the district schools? How do we like get funding and resources, make space and time for our teachers to be able to connect with different artworks, to make and play themselves, and through engaging with that process, they then remember what it's like and they remember the joy of doing those things. And then that is like the starting point for them advocating and prioritizing it in children's lives. I mean, that's certainly been my experience. And I think a lot of the different people have different assumptions and ideas around what constitutes quality arts education. And a lot of those assumptions are based on opportunities that people have had throughout their life. Yeah. And in different schooling systems around the world, there's like very different ideas of what quality arts education looks like. Yeah. And that's totally just based on cultural differences and also opportunity. And so some parents, like if you give them a ball of clay, they'll be like, you know, and you see them say to the kid, you need to make a snail. Yeah. Whereas like kids might be happy to just like touch it and squeeze, and then over time be like, oh, let's make a snake, or, you know, let's make a ball and see where it goes from there, as opposed to like right from the word go being like, you need to make this. Yeah. And so I think, yeah, giving parents the opportunity to make and play alongside artists can be really transformative.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, because I would love to, like, if you could share more about this process versus
Mm.
like outcome, which has always been the focus for arts.
Yeah.
And especially if you have had any conversations with people who were might like rigid in the beginning, but then
Mm.
over the time when they were started playing and opening up their bodies, they actually realized like, oh, like, yeah, this is the importance of arts. And I'm curious, like,
Yeah.
what has been your, because you have worked across like public schools here in Boston and
Yes.
like in different parts. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, how, because I'm sure you would have also met people who are like, even art educators sometimes are uptight, and they like, it has to be neat and clean and all of those words which come up with art sometimes in classrooms. So I'm curious if you're like had these experiences too.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, again, like I think everyone is doing the best they can with the knowledge and resources that they've got. But I do think that, and a lot of school teachers are under such pressures and constrictions in terms of like the amount of time that they get each day to like do art with kids. Like some of it would be like 38 minutes,
Yeah.
including like
Clean
setting
up
up and clean up. So the kids only get like 20 minutes of doing it. And then, in other circumstances, like I have, friends and colleagues who, they don't have an art classroom. So the setup they're like on a trolley. And so they're like setting up the moment they step into the classroom while explaining the activity. Like it's wild, the conditions that folks are working under. But yeah, I think like some of my instinct around some of the hesitations are in terms of like engaging in process-based art are to do either with like mess and like, oh, that's going to be too tricky to set up and pack down. And I think that sometimes mess, like there's a misconception that mess equals not learning, and which I don't think is true. I think learning is messy, art is messy, play is messy, life is messy. And so embracing a bit of that is important. And there's different ways we can mitigate mess in the classroom. I think as well, like a lot of it comes down to like these like kind of global learning measurement systems. Like I'm talking about MCAS, NAPLAN. Do they have one in India?
It's different in India.
Okay, they're all around the world. And so these are standardized tests in which looking for measuring cause and effect relationships around literacy and numeracy. And a lot of these, the metrics under which learning is assessed comes down to like skill development and like hard skill development. So like technique and being able to like, oh, does the kid know how to shade? Does the kid know the difference between primary and secondary colors? Stuff like that. And I think that like different teachers get caught up in that way of thinking because it's like so dominant in the schooling systems. But the contributions of the arts, like technique is absolutely an important part. I'm not saying that at all, but it's an important part alongside other dispositions and like studio habits of mind that the children are engaging in. And like I'm a huge fan of like Bill Lucas's 5-dimensional model of creativity and how that kind of talks about the importance of developing imagination, collaborative learning, things like that happen alongside the acquisition of different, like a particular set of craft skills. And so I think that also plays a really big piece in the puzzle around different teachers' ideas of like what is important and what needs to be prioritized. And so I think like through just engaging in conversations about what our assumptions are of children and their capabilities and also what our assumptions are of what quality arts education like constitutes. I guess like I always pause and kind of think about like when you walk into a classroom and you see all the kids have done these like portraits or turkeys of like, and they're all exactly the same. What makes me nervous is I was like, well, the kids haven't been able to like express or explore their curiosities or interests in this. And children do not look the same as humans. So it's not even representational. But yeah, and it's also really limiting in terms of children using their sensory systems to engage in learning. So yeah, I guess there are the things that I pause on, but I also can understand and see how an adult would come to think, oh, but that's quality, because the system would push them towards that.
Yeah, I'm curious. I think you have mentioned a lot of like wonderful things, which I would like to ask you a little bit more about. This whole idea of assessments, which I think is like a big thing, because also
It's
like
huge.
how like kind of putting this like soft hard skill comparison, like how arts is like soft skills, like this creativity, imagination, but it's also actually it's like making you better like humans. I mean, I'm biased maybe, but
Yeah.
in the sense of like there is like a lot of research around that, and like with your courses also like we have worked on, and like how like these are actually very like academic quote unquote things which children are learning when they're doing
Yeah.
arts as well. And I think this whole misconception about like why like these are skills like which are like an extra.
I guess my concern with these like standardized tests is that it's really robbing children of the opportunity to think about themselves in a way that is more than just like a test score and is more than just like literacy and numeracy. And, you know, in life, we need to develop skills. We need to learn how to work as teams.
Yeah.
We need to learn to like think about something from different people's perspectives. And like the arts is such a wonderful mechanism for helping to facilitate that. And so, yeah, I really hope that in the future there will be more of a push, you know, in countries like the US where there's so much standardized testing, that towards like thinking about different models of how learning can be captured. And I feel like, you know, looking to like Reggio Emilia and their processes of documentation and different adaptations of that could maybe be pulled together with like, you know, standards in the US. I don't think standards are necessarily in conflict with documentation. I feel like there's opportunity to think creatively around how they can speak to one another. I think that's very important. And yeah, and like ultimately that's going to allow children, like I think about children's rights and their right to be seen as a whole human. And yeah, how we assess learning is such a big piece of the puzzle. But, you know, I'm really hopeful. Like I'm hopeful in terms of, you know, like Peers has developed their new creative thinking assessment framework. And I think that's a really great resource for folks to be digging into, looking at and thinking about how they can use and adapt it in different contexts. But yeah, I mean, when you see like some of the narrowed and limited ways in which children are assessed just using like skill-based stuff is like it concerns me. Yeah, so I do believe that the arts, like and how it's taught in schools, is like there is absolutely a really important place for art specific subjects, and I think we need to like not lose sight of that. Like my concern in the rise in kind of like STEM educate or STEAM is that the art teachers then lose their jobs because then, you know, the classroom teacher is doing, I don't know, like a Play-Doh activity or like, I don't know, like a I do think that art teachers bring really specific skills in terms of like technique of the arts. I also think that there is a possibility for, you know, kind of like classroom teachers or teachers across all different disciplines to be working collaboratively with different arts teachers as well. Yeah. You know, like I look at like the Reggio model of like the Atelierista working with the teacher, and I think that's really powerful. And it's not something that just applies to visual arts; it applies to like dancers and, you know, music, performance, everything. And so I think like with that thinking in mind, there are absolutely different ways that like literacy, as an example, can be taught in a way that isn't just like sitting and doing a worksheet or doing these phonics, like these brought in phonics curriculums. I think that, you know, a huge part of literacy, or my understanding of a huge part of literacy is, especially in the early years, is around storytelling and around developing an understanding of words and language within specific contexts. And I think like children's first exposure and love for like language will come through storytelling and through telling stories and listening to stories and reading picture storybooks and stuff like that. And so, yeah, it is a tricky one, but I think that like there are some really wonderful examples out there, like at Boston Arts Academy, how, you know, curriculum has been developed and taught that kind of like look at arts integration and like teaching math through dance. And so I think that that is something that there's a lot more potential to expand that in the future. And I think collaborations between different like artists, arts teachers, and then, you know, the social science, humanities teachers is incredibly important. Yeah. I mean, I had a student from Indonesia who I'm not so sure of their background, but, you know, I remember when they first started, they were like, you know, for example, why do you use questions as a starting point for like designing a curriculum or designing a lesson plan? And I love these sorts of questions
Yeah.
because they help me to think really deeply around what the kind of core, what is at the core of this
Yeah.
pedagogy. And, you know, as I said, well, because like if we want children to engage in inquiry-based learning, then us, you know, as educators need to be demonstrating that and need to be doing it at like a kind of pedagogical level too. And I don't want curriculum to ever be something that's like a done deal, set in stone, set in concrete. Curriculum should be alive and emerging and constantly responding. So, via starting with a research question, we're starting from a place of curiosity and we're starting from a place of like, what does this mean? And questioning. And I think that is really, really important. And once we kind of talked about that, they were like, oh, that totally makes sense. Yeah. Uh, and I think as well, like the kind of emphasis in like contemporary art and early childhood, we talk a lot about play prompts and play prompts, and we talk about technique and whatnot, but technique is kind of like alongside the play prompt. So to me, that's like around advocating for like curiosity and like prompting deeper thinking and inquiry alongside technique. And I think that was a new way of thinking for this particular student because it was really different to how they had done classroom, you know, class planning previously. Because a lot of, you know, like if you look at how a lot of curriculums are designed, it's like, this is the learning outcome. And that's like right at the top. It's not a question. It's not like, it's like, this is what we want. We want them to develop X, Y, and Z skills. And then it's like a very rigid structure of like what you read out to the kids and like using like different photocopy printouts and stuff like that, and then measuring it in a kind of very like cut and dry way. And so it is just a different way of thinking. And you know, I do really love having those conversations though around at a fundamental level, you know, like why would you let kids just start off playing with cardboard as opposed to like being like, well, everyone's making a city or making a building or something, because it gives at least children the opportunity to like imagine what that material could be, as opposed to like having something projected on them.
Yeah, I love that, and I would love to also like ask you a little bit about our using these contemporary artists, because I think that was new to me too.
No, I think like to me, like both children and contemporary artists are like the biggest points of inspiration and just kind of like blow my brain in terms of what they're doing in the world. And I think like a lot of like the canon of art history has really been dominated by this like white male Eurocentric like lens of like Matisse and Monet and Van Gogh and Michelangelo and stuff like that. And look, they all did some pretty bad things, but there are so many other people around the world of different genders, of different ethnicities, of different races who are doing incredible stuff, and stuff of now responding to like real-time crazy stuff that's happening in the world in this moment, and experimenting with materials in like mind-blowing ways. And so it just makes like sense to me that, you know, like we can look at these artists and their material experimentation. And I think that some part of like our role as arts educators is like thinking about those connections that can be made between that and then how we get it into a starting point for children's play and interaction, because it's certainly not about children replicating what these contemporary artists do. It's definitely an emphasis on like materiality, material play. And yeah, I mean, for me, I think like one of the biggest points of inspiration is like going to museums, going to art biennales, like seeing, I mean, I kind of hate social media, and then I love it because like when you see all these interesting artists and you're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that this existed. This is fascinating. And I think as well, we can really draw on artists who, you know, they aren't necessarily doing stuff for kids, but I think it's our role as arts educators to like look at what they've done and make those connections. And so I think it's about like also highlighting our profession as arts educators and the important role that we play in terms of setting up the conditions for learning.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful also and profound, because how you bring these like adult artists who are maybe just not thinking about education, they are creating their own artwork, and then you create this amalgamation of like education, arts, and how everything is like kind of overlapped and this circle instead of like a linear line. And I think that's such a big part of like bringing these like worlds together also with like, adults. And I'm curious now, I would love to ask you also more about your book which is coming up, and I'm curious like how have you thought about that, and like how it is so essential for parents also to be part of this learning. and it's
Yeah.
not just like schools or classroom spaces, but it's all around the child.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm really excited about my book. So it will be released on September 29 with Workman Publishing, and the title is Every Child is an Artist. I think it's 32 art activities to cultivate children's curiosity. And it's a book for parents and carers and families. And in it, it's like different chapters are focused around different materials, looking at different artists who have explored those materials and how we can set up different provocations for children's play. And with that, what I'm really excited about is that it's kind of really returning to the roots of my career and working with parents and families and carers and thinking about how we take all these ideas, and because it's all, been the ideas and findings that are contained in the book have been developed through my years of working as a researcher and in academia, but thinking about how we then put it into a form that is useful to parents. And I'm really looking forward to it coming out, because I'm looking forward to doing different events with children and families in different cities, and it just be fun and creative. But I also think, like, at the core of the book, it's really thinking about how we position parents as children's first educators, and parents as like giving them just some starting points for them reconnecting with their own sense of like creativity and playfulness alongside their kids, and how we really integrate children's voices into their home environment and also in terms of like how we can like integrate creativity and art into like just children's everyday lives. And I also think like in terms of the materiality that it's really about rethinking what an art material is. An art material is not as just being stuff that we order from a catalog, but that are all around us. And so, from a sustainability perspective, from an accessibility perspective, thinking about how we collect and gather and present these materials is like really, really important. And I think that's what like Ramita and Creative Recycle Centres do so well, is that they provide a reimagining of materials in art, in children's lives. And so I think that it is a really, really important piece of the puzzle, because I'm not just interested in, teaching kids like to use an iPad or to, that is an important thing, but like they also need like the tactility of playing and making with these different
young, and children develop ideas of, I'm not good at art, I'm not good at dancing, I'm not good at this, and it's really unfortunate. But I think that as well, the other thing I'll just like add as a caveat to that is like, I feel like for many people who have pursued careers in the arts, they've had like one parent, like one teacher, and sometimes that's all it takes. Is having like one really, really good teacher who like really inspires and convinces others that like this is really important and you're really good at this and you need to take this and run with it. Even though there are definitely some shortcomings of the education system, I think that there are also incredible points for like inspiration and transformation, especially in teachers who like are going to advocate for this work, that it can be really powerful.
And I'm curious because you have been doing that at Harvard too, like you have been like literally like being there and supporting art so much. And I'm curious, like now that we come up to this conversation about concerns and challenges also to bring this arts in spaces, because it's not easy. I mean, you have been like doing so much around arts, and we have so much arts because like you have been like voicing for it. And I'm curious, like what has been your challenges around also bringing more arts to spaces which might not work out, even in like Harvard. Like I have seen that like people don't understand it, and it's been like a whole journey of like bringing this, showing them like why it works also, but in different ways.
I mean, I think Harvard is a unique place in that like there are all of these like brilliant, really smart people who all have their different niche areas. And like everyone wants the kind of spotlight on their area. And so I feel like it's not necessarily the case of someone being like, the arts aren't important, but it's someone more like, this thing over here is more important, this is what we've got to put the spotlight on. So I think like sometimes it's just about like building, I actually think like, I don't know, I've always kind of believed that actions often speak louder than words. And so through, like, I'm really interested in, setting up my coursework and assessment in a way where students are doing different events and developing different programs and drop-in activities and performances, and then inviting other people along to be a part of it so that they can come to understand the level of like depth and rigor that has gone into the decision making that sits behind this, and they can see it and feel it and live it. And then, you know, have the students talk about it, have me talk about it alongside that. I think that that is one of the most transformative ways to kind of advocate for this work, as opposed to like, you know, going along and just being like, well, we should do this because it's important. Like, people need to live it and experience it to then be like, this is important. And so I think that that has been a really powerful mechanism. And yeah, I think that as well, like any, like you need to also think about like how you form a network of allies. So not necessarily other people who are artists, but like other people who are going to stand by and be like, I see the value in this, let's work together, let's do something. And that can be on a smaller scale, that could be on a bigger scale, but I think that that is really, really important. So I also think about, you know, different allies, how we can, because if we are working together, that's so much more powerful than like working in silos. And so many arts educators do work in a siloed way because they might be the only teacher at their school, or they might be the only professor in their department, or, you know, and so I think like how we form those collaborations and those networks is super important, and it's, you can't underestimate it. And so that's where I feel like, you know, in terms of like, you know, once you graduate or whatnot, you need to maintain, like, even if it's just like 3 or 4 people whose opinion you really, really value, who you know you can turn to when, you know, you don't get that grant, or like you don't, you're like, look, I really need to like think about where the next stage of my career is. People like those conversations and relationships are what can push this forward in such a bigger way within any institution.
Yeah, I know that. Wow, yeah, it makes me think about like, yeah, that is so true, because it also makes me think about when we used to do these table activities and people are like, wow, I have not touched arts in so long.
Yeah.
And then when they sit on the table and then they create and they feel this joy, which again is so underrated. What do you think, like, what might happen if we lose out on like arts and creativity in all kinds of spaces? And like, why do you think it's so essential to have arts? If you have to like summarize to this conversation.
I think the arts is so important because they provide a portal into that children or any human can enter into, in which they can like think in this experimental, creative, multi-perspective, embodied way. And there are not a lot of other opportunities in life in which they can do that. So my concern with the arts being like marginalized from schools or from higher education is that we're going to be then cultivating these really narrow definitions of intelligence and what constitutes as truth. Whereas like my understanding is that there's always multiple truths which are based on different people's lived experiences, the different assumptions that they hold, and like the arts are incredibly important mechanism for allowing us to explore that like kind of pluralism and like different ways of like learning and knowing and being in the world. So I mean, I'm hopeful that the arts there's different people working in the arts who will continue to advocate for this no matter what the kind of circumstances are. But I also think we're at a really important point in, you know, world history where we really need to be thinking around what we want our future to be and like how we can produce that. And I think that the arts play this incredibly important role in terms of like helping to cultivate that. So
yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. And I always end my podcast with asking them one question you're sitting with right now.
One question. I mean, I have been thinking a lot around, you know, expanding, you know, this kind of pedagogy of connecting children's rights and play and contemporary art. And, you know, that was something that we've done a lot in Boston, but like how this fits in different cultural contexts, how this fits in different countries, and how we put in place like an international network of other people who are also really interested in these ideas, that includes parents, that includes teachers and artists and cultural institutions working together. And so at the moment I'm really kind of grappling as to, you know, like how to kind of set that up and like what that can look like and how it can be sustained over time, because I think that that kind of collaborative relationships, that kind of like those research partnerships that are going to be really transformative in continuing to advocate for this work in the future.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you.